After the shots were fired at Bridge in 1875, rebellion flared throughout. In upper New York, frontiersmen stormed the fort and swept British law from control. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress placed the stamp of legality on the rebellions and put the rebel forces under the command of George Washington. But for Washington, the country could do little more, for it had no power to taxes or army. So from his headquarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Washington wrote the first of many appeals to the separate state legislatures. On the whole, I cannot estimate the present army at more than 14,500 men capable of duty, under great disadvantages for want of tents. Throughout the war, he was forced continually to beg for supplies and for men. In the ranks of Washington's army were few professional soldiers. These men were volunteers, civilians who knew little discipline and less respect. Training such an army would be the work of a summer and a winter. But holding the army together was to be the trial of the revolution for 8 years. The frontiersman did not join for a long war. He came to fight while the battle was near his home. The boy enlisted for 6 months until his father would need him back at work. The tradesmen signed up only for the winter months, while business was slack. Lacking unity of purpose, failing in support from Congress, the Army's task seemed hopeless. And in the winter of 1775, hope flickered and faded. From a colonial press in January 1776 came a work of great influence. In his pamphlet, Common Sense, Tom Paine called out that dare oppose not only the tyranny, but the tyrant. Stand forth. King George was branded the royal brute of Great Britain. And as the pamphlet was carried throughout the colonies, a singleness of purpose developed. From his headquarters, contained in the pamphlet Common Sense, will not leave numbers at a loss to decide upon the propriety of and separation, or independence, became the battle cry and the cause. That summer in Philadelphia, representatives of the various colonies met and debated their separate grievances and purposes in rebellion, and then signed one of the greatest documents of history, the Declaration of Independence. It rang throughout the colonies, challenging all groups and sections to unite. In Williamsburg, it proclaimed the right of revolution and the principle of government by the consent of the governed. In the harbors of New England, it proclaimed the right of and the wrong of taxation without representation. In the frontier cabins, it proclaimed the principle of human dignity and natural right for all men. In the capitals of Europe, it sounded a threat to the Empire of Britain and a promise of new trade with the colonies. It sounded clearly for all that here were a people united in a common cause, independence. In the summer of 1776, Washington had the largest support he was to enjoy. As he focused his attention on New York, he had an army of 18,000 men. But the British were coming with a fleet of ships and 30,000 men. By September of 1776, the British held New York and were moving on Philadelphia. Washington was in retreat. November, White Plains, New York. Here, Washington, trying desperately to hold a line, is critical and fast approaching. From 18,000 men, his army dropped to 5,000. And as he retreated across New Jersey, it dropped to 3,000 men. To hold men whose enlistments were up New Year's Day, Washington needed a victory. At Trenton, he found it on Christmas night by crossing the Delaware River. This surprise maneuver was a success, and Washington was able to hold his army together. Meanwhile, in London, the British were mapping a grand strategy. Down from Canada was to march an army. Out to meet it from New York was to come another. The colonies would be cut in half, and rebellion would be stamped out in local areas. Down from the north came the British under General Burgoyne. When the frontiersmen looked out from Fort Ticonderoga to find the British on the heights above them, the fort fell to the British. But with the redcoats at hand, the frontiersmen left their fields to defend their homes. Saratoga, October 1777. Here, the colonists defeated the grand strategy of the British. The battle was decisive. But the news of Saratoga brought little relief to Washington's army as it moved toward Valley Forge. Here, at Christmas, the Continental Army stumbled into its winter encampment. And here, the task of holding that army together reached its crisis. Lacking strength to prosecute the war, desperately short of food and clothing, even Washington came to believe that they must either starve, dissolve, or disperse. The army held together through a winter marked with blood and death. The price for independence, paid by John Waterman and hundreds of comrades. It was from Paris that hope was to come. With a coonskin cap and a smile, Benjamin Franklin had been pleading the American cause at the French court. On hearing the news of Saratoga, France signed a treaty of alliance with the United States of America. Spurred on by this new hope, Washington fought on for 3 more